A bloody handprint, yet impossibly high above. Welcome to Fabled Codex. I'm your host, Mithrin. Tell me in the comments where you're joining from. Your voices bring this journey alive. Now, let's uncover the truth. The autumn of '89 had settled upon Baker Street with that peculiar mixture of soot and chill which London reserves for her more contemplative moods. My practice was steady but unexciting. Holmes was in one of his spare, hawk-like tempers that presaged either violin sonatas at 3 in the morning or a crime of such oddity that even his mercurial mind might condescend to be amused. It was early yet, the coal fire new lit, the street not long awake, when the bell clanged with an insistence that brought Mrs. Hudson's reproachful footfall along the passage, and, shortly thereafter, Inspector Lestrade of Scotland Yard into our sitting room. He looked, as ever, like a very alert ferret who had been hurried from his burrow. His hat was powdered with a faint grey, for the morning's mist had taken to the chimney-pots and would not be shaken off. "Mr. Holmes," said he, declining the chair Holmes indicated, and remaining stiff upon the hearth-rug, "I have no patience for your theatricals today, if you please. I am come upon business, curious business." "Your visits are my only theatre, Lestrade," Holmes returned, drawing his dressing-gown about him and extending his long legs toward the blaze. "You bring me the script, the actors, and on fortunate days the villain. Pray be seated, Watson, the notebook. We may yet earn our bread." Lestrade's sharp little eyes went from Holmes to me and back again, as though he feared that by sitting he should somehow fall into a trap of wit. He compromised by perching upon the very edge of the chair. "It's the strangest room I have seen in 20 years at the Yard," said he. "And the strangest mark in it," Holmes murmured, taking up his clay pipe and tapping it gently against his palm. "We are to have a mark. Proceed. A gentleman by the name of Sir Geoffrey Burnwell, Baronet of Fensham Hall, was found dead an hour after midnight, in his study at his London house in Brook Street. His butler, a respectable man who has been with the family 15 years, discovered him." "Cause?" asked Holmes, turning his pale profile toward the fire in a way I had come to recognize as profound attention, masked by indifference. "A blow to the head from behind," Lestrade returned. "Not a heavy instrument, no pistol butt or poker, more like a neat crack with some rounded thing. There's a contusion above the right ear, and a line of broken skin. No other wounds. Robbery." "No, his watch in his pocket. A tidy roll of notes in a drawer. A jeweled paper knife on the desk untouched. Nothing missing as far as the butler and the housekeeper can tell at present. Then we have a domestic drama, or a caller admitted and trusted," Holmes observed lightly. "And the strangest mark." Lestrade drew a breath that was almost a whistle. "A handprint, Mr. Holmes." Holmes's eyes slid to him. "Blood. No dust, soot, something dark, but as clear as if the hand had been pressed into wet clay. You may see every finger and the web between them, the line of the thumb, and a little scar at the base, if I'm not mistaken." His voice had grown low with an unwilling fascination. "It is upon the ceiling." "The ceiling?" I repeated. "The ceiling," Lestrade said doggedly, "over the desk where the deceased had fallen. There is a great chandelier. The hand mark is some 2 feet from it, upon the painted plaster, as plain as daylight, and, if you will believe it, upside down." Holmes removed the pipe from between his fingers and looked at it as though it had betrayed him. "Upside down?" The fingers point toward the wall, the heel of the hand toward the chandelier, and the study door was locked on the inside. At this, Holmes's eyes quickened. "We progress. Pray sketch the arrangement for us." Lestrade produced a small notebook in which he had made with surprising neatness a plan of the room. He placed it upon our table and leaned in, a forefinger tracing lines. "Door here. Windows upon the street, both latched. The desk stands forward of the central window. Our man lies beside the chair in which he had been sitting. The blow seems to have come from behind, as I said. He fell sideways, knocking over the ink. The ink made a devil of a mess, but there is no sign of a struggle. The chandelier is above. The handprint, here." Holmes bent over the drawing, his brows knitting into that single dark line I knew so well. "An admirable plan, Lestrade. The fireplace?" "There," said Lestrade, indicating the opposite wall. The grate had been used, coal burned down to a red heart, no poker out of place, and the housekeeper swears the study was dusted that afternoon. which renders a hand upon the ceiling the more significant, Holmes murmured. He leaned back. Tell me of Sir Geoffrey, a bachelor nearing 50, a sportsman, something of a clubman too, kept a small staff in London, housekeeper, butler, a cook and 2 maids. No known enemies. The neighbours heard nothing. Brook Street at that hour is quiet. He had dined at his club, returned at 11 and sent the butler to bed. The housekeeper woke at 12:15 to the sound of something fallen, she says she is a light sleeper, and came down. She found the study door locked. She roused the butler, and together they broke in. Sir Geoffrey was dead or near enough. The physician at hand says life had departed within minutes. Windows fastened, no sign of entry? None, and the soot, if soot it be, upon the ceiling. The doctor scratched his head and said he had never seen its like. I confess, nor have I. Holmes rose and paced to the window. Outside, the fog dragged its reluctant skirts along the street, a grey, shapeless thing. He stood a moment with his back to us, the line of his shoulders tense. When he turned, his eyes had that cold, brilliant light in them, which always set my heart to beating a little faster. Lestrade, said he, you have come to the right house. I thought I might, the inspector replied with a mixture of relief and resentment. You'll come at once. Holmes took up his coat. At once. Watson, if you are at liberty. Entirely, said I, for there is no summons in the world that could have kept me from such a problem. As we made ready, Lestrade added almost as an afterthought, there is one other small matter, if it be of any interest to you. A smear upon the cornice not far from the hand, like a graze of something dragged, and a burnt smell that is not coal. The housekeeper remarked it too. Holmes paused, one arm in his sleeve. A burnt smell, but not coal, he repeated softly. How would you describe it? Lestrade wrinkled his nose. Sharp, not unpleasant. Like, well, I am no chemist. The devil may know. The devil, Holmes said, smiling without warmth, is frequently invoked when a man lacks the correct word. He thrust his arms fully into the coat and snatched up his cane. Come, gentlemen, we shall let Brook Street tell us what it will. Before the day crowds out the night's confidences, the hansom bore us swiftly westward through a city that seemed, at that hour, to have been half erased and sketched again in pencil. The gas lamps were wan ghosts, the pavements, faint arteries along which the milkmen and sweepers moved like white blood. Holmes sat silent, his chin upon his breast and his eyes closed as if asleep. I knew better than to intrude upon whatever strange and airy chamber of mind he had entered. Lestrade, opposite me, fidgeted and cleared his throat from time to time, like a man who has told all and yet fears that he has told it badly. Brook Street received us with its sober brick fronts and iron railings. Sir Geoffrey's house was the third in the row, its door already ajar and a constable stationed there, cap in hand. We were admitted with the diffident haste which attends such circumstances, and presently found ourselves in a handsome study. Tall windows curtained against the morning, shelves of calf-bound volumes, a Turkey carpet subdued and costly, and in the centre the desk, broad, leather-topped, and disordered with a sprawl of papers and an up-ended ink bottle, whose black stain had crept like a sinister tide across the green. Sir Geoffrey lay no longer upon the floor. The body had been removed to a cooler chamber, yet the room retained that solemn hush which death leaves behind, as though the air itself were aware of its trespass and muffled its step. Holmes stood beneath the chandelier and lifted his gaze to the ceiling. I followed it and started. There upon the pale plaster, as clear as if some giant had pressed his palm upon a printing block, was the hand. The fingers were spread, the thumb held a little apart, and at the base of the thumb a nick or scar gave character to the mark. It was inverted, as Lestrade had said, the pads of the fingers pointing towards the book-lined wall. The substance of it had the dull granular look of chimney black, rubbed into flesh and then into paint. Holmes's eyes travelled slowly round from the print to the cornice, where, upon a moulding near the angle, there ran a narrow smear, as if something had grazed it, leaving behind a shadow. He inhaled delicately and his nostrils flared. "You perceive it, Watson?" he asked, not taking his eyes from above. "I perceive the hand," said I, "and a faint odour, yes, something acrid." "A burnt smell," Lestrade put in. "You see, I was not mad. I was not mad. On the contrary," Holmes murmured, "you are admirably sane. It is the room that is mad." He dropped to one knee beside the desk, where the ink had dried in a glossy pool, and examined the edge of the leather with his lens. He touched the blotter, sniffed at a torn scrap of paper that had adhered to the lip of a drawer, and glanced towards the grate, in which a few greyed lumps of coal still smouldered, sulking like extinguished stars. "Watson," said he very softly, "observe the chandelier. Note the dust upon the upper curve of the brass. And there, do you see? A tiny crescent lacking. Lestrade, you have brought me a charming riddle. We shall answer it, and with it some other questions you have not yet thought to ask. And the hand upon the ceiling?" The inspector demanded. Holmes's smile sharpened. "It is either the most natural thing in the world," said he, "or it is a lie. In either case, it is the beginning." Holmes's first movement was toward the windows. He unlatched one with his long forefinger and lifted it an inch, then let it fall again, listening to the little click of the brass tongue against the catch. He tried the second. His hand paused upon the sash and his head bent, the thin nostrils tasting the air as a hound tastes water. "Lamp oil," he murmured. "Refined? Not from your kitchen, I think, Mrs. Grant." The housekeeper, a compact woman with a resolute mouth, had been hovering at the threshold with that mixture of sorrow and proprietary vigilance peculiar to her trade. "No, sir. We burn coal oil below, and I should know the scent." "That is different. Different indeed." Holmes drew from his pocket a small strip of white card, and moistening it with his tongue, pressed it against the inner face of the sash near the catch. When he removed it, there clung to it the faintest dull smear. "Watson, you perceive the viscosity. A trace of paraffin, though thinly laid. Lestrade, note that the exterior paint upon the sill is undisturbed. We have no sign of ingress here, yet someone has paid the latches a courtesy." "The door was locked on the inside," Lestrade insisted, as if that one fact were a fortress to shelter him from Holmes's insinuations. "We forced it." The key was in the lock. Holmes crossed at once to the door. The panel bore the jagged bruise of a forced entry. He crouched, peering at the key, which still projected from the inner ward. He took out his lens and examined the bevels with a tender care that I had seen him lavish upon a scar, upon a corpse, or the petal of a rare flower. "A clean key," he said quietly. "But see, upon the inner escutcheon a crescent too, though minute." He indicated a minute arc where dust had been disturbed on the brass plate, mirroring the one he had noted upon the chandelier. "Two crescents seldom meet by accident. Draw the bolt, Lestrade." "There is no bolt." "Precisely. Therefore the key served the purpose alone. Mrs. Grant, you and the butler broke in together." "We did, sir." "I fetched Mr. Peveril out of his bed." He struck the door with his shoulder. "And until that moment," Holmes continued, his eyes upon the carpet, "no one entered the study?" "No one, sir." "I am as sure as I stand here. Then let us hear Mr. Peveril." The butler came, a tall, elderly man with the austere quiet of a long habit of discretion. He stood, hands properly folded. Yet I observed a nervous twitch of the right thumb against the left palm, as if to rub some memory away. "You have been with Sir Geoffrey 15 years, said Holmes without preface. "His habits?" "Regular, sir. He retired often here to write his letters when in town. He would ring for tea at 9 of an evening. He disliked heavy liquors. He smoked a light cigar from Pearson's in Bond Street." Holmes's gaze slid to the ash bowl on the desk. He took up a pinch and let it sift between finger and thumb. "Trichinopoly, by the hue and cut." "Not Pearson's. Did Sir Geoffrey sometimes vary his brand?" "Rarely, sir. Yet last night, after he returned from his club, he wrote letters." "Yes, sir." "I laid his tray at 11:30, sandwiches and a carafe. He bid me good night and said he would not be disturbed." Holmes pointed with his cane to a blot on the floor. "The ink was upset when he fell. Before that he wrote what?" The butler hesitated. "There is a half-finished letter upon the blotter, sir." Holmes turned the sheet with a gloved finger. The writing, a bold, firm hand, had been arrested mid-sentence. "And if you insist upon such terms, then you leave me no course but—" He looked up. "To whom?" "There is the envelope, sir, with R.A. only and no address. Sir Geoffrey had an address book, if it please you. It will please me later." Holmes set the paper down, and his attention swept again to the ceiling. "Oh, you spoke of a smell, Mrs. Grant. That was not coal." "I did, sir. It came after the crash, I think. Sharp and a little sweet." Holmes drew a chair beneath the chandelier and stepped upon it with the agility of a cat. He ran the edge of his lens along the upper curve of the brass, where the dust lay in a fine, undisturbed veil, save for that narrow arc where it had been brushed away. "Something passed over here," he said. "Something under tension. Note the clean, decisive line. A cord lightly tarred, paraffin from the window latch upon the fingers that arranged it, perhaps. The cornice smear here." He reached to the molding and brought down upon his fingertip a faint grey thread. "Soot and, fibre. Hemp, I should say." Lestrade craned his neck. "What in heaven's name do you climb a chandelier with a hemp cord for?" "Not to climb it," Holmes returned, springing lightly down, "but to make it serve as a pulley." "A pulley?" I cried. "Good God, Holmes, consider the geometry, Watson. A cord over the chandelier's upper arm, the running end fixed to some object, and the standing part passed to the desk. The desk bears here a faint abrasion at the leather's edge, as from a taut line. If one wished to raise a weight to the ceiling, a man might manage it from the floor with a steady hand." "Raise what?" Lestrade demanded, exasperated. Holmes tilted his head toward the hand upon the plaster. "A hand." There was a little silence in which the distant rumble of a carriage seemed absurdly to intrude upon our thoughts like a laugh. Lestrade recovered first. "You mean to tell me, Mr. Holmes, that our murderer hoisted himself like a sack to the ceiling to plant that devil's mark?" "I mean to tell you," Holmes replied with a faint smile, "that the mark was planted by a hand that was not at the moment attached to a climbing man. Observe the scar at the base of the thumb. The same scar occurs, Watson, upon the glove in the umbrella stand." We all turned. Holmes had, during his silent circuit, cast a passing eye on the rack by the door. He now drew forth a right-hand glove of dark kid, upon the palm of which there showed a pale oval, where the leather had been worn and mended. A stitch, neat but palpable, at the very base of the thumb. "Sir Geoffrey's?" asked I. Mrs. Grant shook her head. "No, sir. That is not the baronet's size. He had broad hands." "That is slimmer. Who then in this household has a hand of this proportion and a scar at the thumb?" Holmes inquired, looking straight at the butler. Peveril's eyes flicked, almost imperceptibly, to his right hand, where, indeed, a faint pale seam lay at the base of the thumb, old, but indelible. "I caught it on a broken decanter 10 years ago, sir," he said evenly. "I have served with it since." Holmes's tone was bland. "And served very well, I do not doubt. The presence of your glove here proves only that you possess gloves. Pray do not be disturbed. Mrs. Grant, has the household any step-ladder?" "In the scullery, sir. Have it brought." He moved again to the window, tried the latch once more, and then, kneeling, examined the carpet where the desk's caster had bitten deep. Weight pulled forward, then released. The cord was drawn and then freed, else we should see fray upon the leather. We have then a device, a cord over the chandelier, a hand charged with soot, drawn up and impressed upon the ceiling, the cord freed and whipped back over the cornice, hence the smear. The paraffin at the latch, used to ease some small contrivance, but not for entrance. The door locked from within, the key turned by other than a human hand, perhaps. "A string," I ventured, seeing the line of his thought. "Passed under the door, looped upon the key, and pulled." "Excellent, Watson. A very schoolboy's trick, yet schoolboys become men and take their toys with them. You perceive, Lestrade, that we are in the presence of a mind which delights in the theatrical. It is not the devil upon the ceiling. It is a conjurer upon the floor." The stepladder arrived, and Holmes mounted to the cornice. With a penknife he lifted from a groove a minute, almost invisible shaving of wax. "Not tallow," he murmured. "Refined candle wax of a quality kept not in kitchens. A taper, perhaps, to coat a line. And the odour?" He held the shaving to his nose and smiled. "Camphorated oil. A man who keeps his cord supple." He descended and stood very still, his head inclined, his eyes half shut, as though to listen to the arrangement his mind had made of these scattered notes. When he spoke, his voice had that crisp assurance which always made me at once confident and curious. "Lestrade, you will oblige me by learning who R.A. may be among Sir Geoffrey's acquaintance, who sold him his last pair of gloves, and whether at his club he spoke of a meeting for last night. Mrs. Grant, I will see the servants each alone, beginning with the second housemaid who, I think, dusted this room yesterday. Watson, we must go to Bond Street afternoon. There is a tobacconist and a lamp merchant who will tell us more truth than any man meaning to hide it." "And the murderer?" Lestrade demanded, his pencil already flying. Holmes's smile returned, very slight and very chill. "He is a man who distrusts his own height," said he, "and trusts very much to his clever hands. We shall make him use them again, Only next time, Lestrade, we shall be watching. Holmes began his interviews with the servants as the clock in the hallway struck 10. The housekeeper brought in the younger maid first, a timid creature with reddened hands and eyes that darted from the carpet to the ceiling but never once met Holmes's gaze. He had drawn her to a chair by the window, where the light fell fully upon her face, and he regarded her with that mild indifference which always drew the truth more surely than stern command. "You dusted this room yesterday afternoon?" he asked gently. "Yes, sir," she murmured, "at 3:30. I remember because I had just taken in Sir Geoffrey's tea." "And at that time," Holmes continued, "was there any mark upon the ceiling?" "Think carefully." She shook her head so quickly her cap ribbons trembled. "No, sir. The plaster was clean. Mrs. Grant is strict about such things. She had me wipe the ledge above the door as well. There was nothing out of place. Nothing at all. Not even the smell that lingers here still?" Her brows knit. "No smell, sir. Only the polish on the desk." Sir Geoffrey was writing then. He looked at me once and said I was to take great care not to smudge the corners of his papers. Holmes nodded, satisfied, and dismissed her with a kindly word. He turned to the inspector. "So the handprint did not exist at 3:30. We may narrow the time of its creation to the hours of darkness." The butler was summoned next, but Holmes asked him little beyond what had already been established. Instead, he examined the man's gloves again, turning them over with such languid grace that one might have thought him interested in the stitching alone. The butler betrayed no more emotion than a marble bust, save that twitch of the thumb I had marked earlier. When he was excused, Mrs. Grant herself submitted to Holmes's questions, answering with brisk certainty that no one had entered or left the house between the baronet's return and the discovery of his body. With the servants gone, Holmes wandered back to the desk and lifted the unfinished letter once more. "You leave me no course but— What, Watson, would you supply as the natural conclusion?" "Resignation," I suggested. "Or perhaps a duel if we were in France." Holmes gave a brief laugh. "Our baronet was not a duellist, nor I suspect a man given to resignations. The abrupt cessation is most telling. He was interrupted, and not by accident. A deliberate hand struck, Watson, to silence words of moment." He folded the letter carefully and slipped it into his own pocket. Lestrade grumbled, "But who is this R.A.? I've sent a man to the club already, but I doubt they'll know him. Burnwell was secretive." "Secrecy," Holmes replied, "is rarely proof against the tobacco one smokes or the company one keeps at dinner. You will have your answer by evening, but I shall not wait so long. Come, Watson, we must not lose the scent while it is warm." We left the house with Lestrade muttering about the futility of chasing brands of cigars, but Holmes hailed a cab and gave the address of Bond Street. The fog had thickened. Hansoms moved like phantoms through a shifting curtain, and more than once our driver checked his horse for fear of colliding with an invisible dray. Holmes sat in silence until at last the cab drew up before a modest tobacconist's shop whose brass sign gleamed faintly beneath the gas lamps. Inside, the air was thick with the pungent sweetness of Virginia and the acrid bite of Turkish leaf. Holmes moved at once to the counter, where a grey-haired proprietor greeted him with cautious courtesy. "You supply Sir Geoffrey Burnwell," Holmes said without preamble. "On occasion, sir. A box of Havanas last month, if memory serves, and Trichinopoly." The tobacconist's eyes brightened. "Ah, that was last week. Unusual choice for him. He came in with a younger gentleman. Dark hair, sharp manner. The younger man bought a packet and pressed one upon Sir Geoffrey, who laughed but accepted. I thought it odd, for the baronet always spoke of preferring the mild leaf." Holmes leaned forward. "Did you know this younger man?" "I have seen him twice before, never alone." He spoke with a faint foreign accent. Might be colonial, might be Irish, paid with sovereigns, though he handled them like a man accustomed to paper. Holmes thanked him with a bow, purchased a small packet for himself, and led me back to the street. "You see, Watson, our R.A. has a taste for the dramatic leaf. A companion who lures Sir Geoffrey to change his brand for a night is one who enjoys influence over him." We draw nearer. "But what of the glove?" I pressed. "You hinted that it bore the butler's scar. Do you suspect him?" Holmes's smile was thin. "I suspect every man until he ceases to fit. The glove is bait, Watson, nothing more. Whoever contrived the sealing's mark meant us to stumble upon it, and upon the scar that matched it. Too neat, too obvious. No, our conjurer casts shadows for us to chase while he himself slips away. We had not gone 100 yards when Holmes halted suddenly, his hand tightening upon my sleeve. A tall figure had emerged from the mist ahead, crossing swiftly to the opposite pavement. He wore a dark coat and carried a stick, and though his face was obscured by the fog, there was a quick, nervous quality in his step that drew Holmes's attention like a flame. "Observe," Holmes whispered. He glances back there, twice in 10 paces. "That is not the walk of an indifferent man. Do you know him?" I asked. "Not yet, but I shall." Holmes hailed another cab at once. "Follow that gentleman," he instructed the driver. "But keep 50 yards. We trailed the stranger through the winding fog-bound streets until he halted at the doorway of a narrow lodging house in a less reputable quarter. He rapped quickly, was admitted, and vanished within. Holmes stood watching, his profile keen against the lamplight, then turned away without a word and led me back into the cab. "Who was he?" I demanded, impatient at his silence. Holmes drew his coat closer. "A man whose scar I should very much like to see, Watson. We shall return when the house is not expecting company. For now the game is best played with patience. Our quarry is bold enough to show himself after a night of murder. That is arrogance or desperation. Both are useful." As the cab rattled toward Baker Street, I could not suppress a shiver. The image of the handprint on the ceiling, black and inverted, hung before my eyes as if branded there. But Holmes sat in perfect composure, the ghost of a smile playing about his lips, already weaving threads of soot-wax glove and tobacco into that tapestry of deduction which only he could so surely complete. The fog clung stubbornly to the lamplight as our cab rattled toward Baker Street, the horse's hooves muffled by the damp. Holmes remained motionless, his eyes closed, yet I knew by the faint tapping of his long fingers against the sill that his mind was alive with calculations. When at last we reached our familiar sitting room, he cast off his coat with the abruptness of a man who has no more use for weather, and went straight to his chemical table. He set the scrapings of soot, the shaving of wax and the fragment of fibre upon separate dishes, his movements delicate and precise. I had learned long since not to interrupt such a process. Instead, I poured myself a glass of brandy and watched him as one might watch a magician preparing his stage. He lit the spirit lamp, added a few drops of reagent, and soon the room was alive with faint odours, acrid, sharp, sweet. Holmes bent close, his profile outlined in the glow, and at length he straightened, satisfaction glinting in his eyes. "Hemp impregnated with camphorated oil," he said softly. "It confirms what we suspected. Our friend requires his cord supple, even noiseless, a sailor's trick, or perhaps that of one who has learned the art from such men." "And the soot?" I asked. "Chimney black mixed with a thin paraffin base. Not accidental, Watson, but applied carefully to the glove, we discovered, that it might leave its impression above. The theatricality of the gesture tells us much. We are dealing with a mind that delights in artifice more than in violence. The blow that killed Sir Geoffrey was almost secondary, a prelude to the performance painted on the plaster. I shuddered at the memory of that inverted hand. And yet the man in the fog, was he the artist? Possibly. But remember, Watson, the hand upon the ceiling is not necessarily the hand that struck the blow. It may merely be the hand that sought to divert our eyes. The true question is not how the print was made, but why it was made at all. Before I could press him further, there came a rap at the door. Lestrade entered, damp and irritable, his hat clutched in his hands. "Well, Mr. Holmes, I have news for you." "I've been to the club. Your mysterious R-Ace is very likely a fellow by the name of Robert Armitage, a barrister of some repute, though more notorious for his debts than his briefs. He was seen in Sir Geoffrey's company last evening, and more than one member overheard sharp words between them." "Excellent," Holmes said, his eyes gleaming. "Did they quarrel openly?" "Loud enough that it was remarked. Something about terms and an agreement broken. But Armitage left before midnight, and the baronet returned home alone. My men are searching his chambers even now." Holmes paced the carpet with quick, eager steps. "Armitage, yes, the initials match the unfinished letter. And a barrister who knows the tricks of lock and key, who delights in rhetoric and display, might well indulge in a gesture so extravagant as a hand upon a ceiling. Tell me, Lestrade, has he a scar upon his thumb?" Lestrade frowned. That I cannot say. But I'll learn it soon enough. Holmes halted suddenly, his gaze sharp. Not too soon, my dear Inspector. If you pounce before the trap is ready, you may drive the fox from the covert and never lay hands upon him again. Better to let him think himself safe, until he betrays himself utterly. You will oblige me by holding your hand. Lestrade's mouth twitched with the effort of patience, but he agreed grudgingly. Very well. But if he bolts, it will be on your head, Mr. Holmes. When the inspector had gone, Holmes threw himself into his chair and steepled his fingers beneath his chin. His voice, when it came, was low and deliberate. Watson, I begin to see the outline of our play. Sir Geoffrey was pressed to terms he would not accept. He was writing his refusal when interrupted. Armitage, or some agent, struck the blow to silence him. Yet instead of flight, our culprit lingered to compose his grotesque emblem above the desk. It is the mark of a man who fears not discovery, but obscurity. He wishes his crime to be talked of, puzzled over, admired for its ingenuity. Vanity, Watson, is often a sharper spur than greed. And yet the butler's scar, was that too part of the display? Assuredly. The glove was planted, meant to cast suspicion within the household, but it was done too neatly, too quickly. A true servant would never leave such a token within reach. Holmes rose again, restless. He fetched his violin and drew the bow across the strings in a slow, brooding phrase. The sound filled the room with melancholy, until suddenly he broke off, set the instrument aside, and exclaimed, We must see Armitage ourselves, not through Lestrade's blunt report, but with our own eyes. There is a quality in a man's manner that no affidavit can reveal. It was near midnight when we set out once more into the fog, Holmes striding with that peculiar energy which seemed to feed upon mystery itself. Armitage's chambers were in the Temple, and a dim lamp burned still in one upper window as we approached. Holmes studied it a long while before leading me to the side entrance, where a porter dozed upon his stool. A visitor for Mr. Armitage, Holmes said smoothly, and a coin changed hands. We were admitted to a stairwell that smelt of damp stone and ink. As we climbed, Holmes's hand brushed mine lightly, a signal for silence. He pressed his ear to the panel of the door at the landing. From within came the scratch of a pen, and after a pause the faint clink of glass. Holmes rapped once. There was a start within, a chair scraping. Then the door opened. A tall, thin man in his 30s stood before us, his dark hair disordered, his eyes sharp but shadowed by fatigue. He wore a dressing gown, and upon his right hand I glimpsed, as he raised it to the lamp, the unmistakable pale seam of an old scar at the base of the thumb. Gentlemen, he said coolly, to what do I owe this intrusion at so late an hour? Holmes's bow was a fraction deeper than courtesy required. We come upon a matter of life and death, Mr. Armitage, and upon a hand which has reached further than it ought. At that, the barrister's eyes flickered, just for an instant. But it was enough. Holmes had seen it. I knew then that our night's labor was only beginning. Armitage ushered us inside with the cool composure of a man who has been long accustomed to verbal duels, though I detected in the tremor of his fingers as he adjusted the lamp an uneasiness that betrayed his outward calm. His chambers were lined with books, briefs stacked untidily upon every surface, and on a side table lay an open cigar case in which the dark twists of trichinopoly leaf gleamed faintly in the lamplight. Holmes's eyes rested upon it for the briefest instant, before sweeping the room with that wide, hawk-like gaze that seemed to take in every crevice at once. You will forgive us the hour, Holmes said, sinking into a chair uninvited. The yard, I believe, is already sniffing at your heels, and I am no friend of precipitate arrests. I prefer to understand a man before condemning him. Armitage's lips curved in a smile that did not touch his eyes. Condemnation, Mr. Holmes, requires evidence. I imagine you have little enough of that, else you would not come here in the guise of courtesy. As for Sir Geoffrey's death, tragic, yes, but nothing to do with me. Holmes crossed his long legs, his expression one of bland indifference. And yet you were heard quarrelling with him last evening at the club. The members found your tones most vigorous. A dispute over money, nothing more, Armitage returned swiftly. Sir Geoffrey had agreed to invest in a scheme of mine, a perfectly respectable undertaking, but at the last moment he withdrew. I was frustrated, naturally, but hardly murderous. A man may speak sharply without striking blows. Indeed, Holmes murmured. He rose and wandered to the table where the cigar case lay open, selecting one between his fingers. A curious choice, sir, trichinopoly, stronger than the Havana Sir Geoffrey preferred. Did you not press one upon him last evening? The barrister's eyes narrowed, and for a heartbeat his composure faltered. He may have taken one, at my urging, I confess, but what of it? Surely the brand of a cigar is not evidence of a crime. Not evidence, Holmes replied lightly, returning the cigar to its case, but it paints the edge of a picture. Tell me, Mr. Armitage, what do you know of paraffin and camphorated oil? The question fell into the room like a stone into still water. Armitage's hand clenched upon the arm of his chair, the scar at his thumb paling with the pressure. I know nothing of such things. You speak in riddles, sir. Holmes smiled faintly. I often do, but the riddles are not of my making. They were written in soot upon Sir Geoffrey's ceiling, in wax upon his cornice, and in the glove which bore your very scar. Theatrics, Mr. Armitage, worthy of a barrister who relishes the drama of the courtroom. You arranged a spectacle, hoping to bewilder the police and cast suspicion elsewhere. But the threads you left behind weave themselves into a net. Armitage rose abruptly, pacing the carpet with the restless energy of a man driven into a corner. You spin conjecture, Holmes. Nothing more. If the Yard accuses me, I shall defend myself as I have defended others. No jury will hang a man for a handprint in soot. Holmes's tone sharpened. Then why was Sir Geoffrey struck down in the very moment he penned a refusal to your terms? Why did you linger to contrive a grotesque display above his corpse? Vanity, Mr. Armitage. You wish to be admired for your cunning even in crime. But vanity leaves fingerprints as surely as soot does. As surely as soot does. For a long moment, the only sound was the crackle of the lamp wick. Then Armitage turned, his features composed once more, though his voice was low and taut. You cannot prove it, and until you can, I advise you to leave. You trespass upon a barrister's chambers, and even Scotland Yard would hesitate to sanction such intrusion without warrant. Holmes regarded him with a curious detachment, as though examining a specimen beneath glass. At last he inclined his head. Very well. I shall not detain you further tonight. But know this, Mr. Armitage, when next we meet it will not be to exchange pleasantries. We left him standing rigid by the table, the scar upon his thumb white against the dark wood. In the fog-bound court outside I turned to Holmes, bewildered. Why let him go? He as much as confessed with his silence. Not confessed, Holmes corrected. Merely betrayed his nerves. But we require more, Watson, something irrefutable. The Yard may arrest him on suspicion, but suspicion alone will not bind him. He is a clever man, trained in evasion. We must have the chain complete, every link forged. Until then he walks free. We hailed a cab and rode in silence until Baker Street loomed once more. As we ascended to our rooms, Holmes's eyes gleamed with a cold light. He has set his stage too proudly to abandon it. He will act again, Watson. Men of his temperament cannot resist a second curtain. And when he does, we shall be waiting. The following morning brought confirmation of Holmes's foresight. Lestrade appeared, bleary-eyed and triumphant, waving a slip of paper. Armitage fled his chambers at dawn. My men tracked him to the docks, but he gave them the slip among the warehouses. He has vanished. Holmes only smiled. Excellent. He plays his part precisely. The chase is more instructive than the capture. Tell your men to watch the lodging house where we saw him enter last night. He will return there. A man may run from the law, but he seldom runs from his lair. Lestrade muttered darkly, but obeyed. When he had gone, Holmes took up his violin once more, the bow moving in a restless area. I knew better than to disturb him, though my own nerves were taut with anticipation. Somewhere in London's fog, a murderer with a taste for theatre was plotting his next scene, and Holmes, with the calm of a master director, was content to let the drama unfold until the precise moment when the curtain must fall. The news of Armitage's disappearance left Lestrade sputtering with frustration, but Holmes regarded it with the air of a man who has anticipated a checkmate 3 moves before his opponent has touched the board. He set aside his violin, rose with that sudden vigor which came upon him when the chase turned lively, and declared that the day must not be wasted. Our barrister has taken flight, Watson, but he has not vanished. He has only shifted scenes. A man who relishes display will not slink into obscurity. He will contrive another stage upon which to impress his audience. We must discover where that stage lies. I accompanied him through the bustle of morning London, where the fog had thinned but still hung stubbornly in the alleys. Holmes chose not the direct route to the docks, but a series of careful detours, pausing at tobacconists, lamp merchants, and one grimy little shop that reeked of sailor's gear. At each place he made some quiet inquiry, a tilt of the head or a half-smile that sufficed to loosen tongues. More than once I heard the name Armitage murmured, or saw a shopkeeper's brow wrinkle with recognition. By noon we had gathered a curious picture. Armitage had purchased cordage of fine hemp, not in great coils but in lengths cut discreetly. He had bought tapers treated with camphor and oil, ostensibly for sealing documents, and most telling of all, he had asked after chemicals used to produce theatrical smoke, as if he were preparing some private spectacle. Holmes noted each fact in his pocketbook with a satisfaction that grew keener by the hour. "Do you see, Watson?" he said as we paused at a corner for a hurried luncheon of meat pie and coffee. "This is not the behavior of a man who seeks to vanish. He gathers props. He rehearses. He intends an encore, and soon." "But where?" I asked. "London is vast and his opportunities innumerable." Holmes's eyes narrowed. "Not so innumerable. He must have a place of safety, a lair from which to emerge. We saw him enter that lodging house in the fog. I would stake my reputation he will return there before long. He cannot resist it. Even foxes circle back to their earths. Tonight, Watson, we shall keep our vigil." The hours dragged heavily until dusk. Holmes occupied himself with experiments at the table, burning fragments of cord and soot to test their composition. I paced the room in restless anticipation, until at last, when the lamps were lit and the city shrouded itself again in mist, Holmes rose and donned his coat. He handed me a small revolver, which I slipped into my pocket, though I confess my hand trembled at the weight. We took a cab to the narrow street, where the lodging house crouched between dingy warehouses. Holmes dismissed the driver and led me into the shadows of a doorway opposite. There we waited, silent as stones, while the fog rolled and the gas lamps guttered above. From time to time a passer-by loomed suddenly out of the grey and vanished again. Hours passed. The chill bit to my very bones, but Holmes remained as still as a carved gargoyle, his eyes fixed upon the door. It was near midnight when a figure appeared at the far end of the street. He moved with furtive swiftness, glancing over his shoulder, and even through the fog I knew that long frame and quick step. Armitage mounted the steps, rapped once, and slipped inside. Holmes touched my arm lightly. As I foretold, the fox is home. We crossed swiftly. Holmes had already procured from Lestrade a skeleton key, and within moments we stood in the dim hallway of the house. The porter's stool was empty. All within was still. Holmes motioned me to silence and led the way up the stair, every board seeming to creak beneath our weight, though Holmes moved with uncanny lightness. At the second landing he halted, listening. From behind a door came the faint scrape of wood against floor and the unmistakable rasp of cord drawn taut. Holmes's eyes gleamed. He drew me close and whispered, "He rehearses his trick again. Patience, Watson. Let him reveal it." We waited, breath held, until the sound ceased. Then Holmes rapped sharply upon the panel. A startled oath, the scuffle of feet, and the door was flung wide. Armitage stood before us, his face pale but his eyes blazing with defiance. Behind him the chamber was strewn with cord pulleys and soot-rubbed gloves. Upon the ceiling a faint new smudge bore witness to his labours. "You," he hissed, "you hounds will not hound me here. I have rights." "Rights?" Holmes said coldly, stepping across the threshold. "You have rehearsals, Mr. Armitage, a barrister who craves an audience even in crime. But this night your audience has arrived sooner than you wished." Armitage backed to the table where a case lay open, papers scattered. His hand groped for a stick, but Holmes was upon him in an instant, wrenching it away with surprising strength. I rushed forward and together we pressed him back into a chair. He fought panting, but when the revolver gleamed in my hand he subsided, his chest heaving. Holmes regarded him with an icy composure. "You may yet speak, Armitage, and lessen your burden. What was your purpose in this grotesque theatre?" "To silence Sir Geoffrey's refusal, yes. But why the hand upon the ceiling?" The barrister's eyes flashed. "Because they would marvel at it. Because they would speak of the cunning of it, not merely of a dead man in his chair. I wanted a trial to remember, a puzzle to confound the world. But he betrayed me, refused me, mocked my genius. I would not let his death be ordinary." His voice broke into bitter laughter that chilled me more than the fog outside. Holmes leaned close, his tone low and terrible. "Then you will have your trial, Armitage, but not as the admired performer. As the condemned. Even as he spoke, there came the heavy tread of boots upon the stair. Lestrade and 2 constables burst in, their lanterns flaring. At Holmes's nod, they seized the prisoner, and the inspector's thin lips curved in grim satisfaction. "You've netted him cleanly this time, Mr. Holmes," Lestrade said. "Caught with his very tools about him. He'll not wriggle out of this." Holmes merely inclined his head, his gaze still fixed upon the barrister. "The play is over, Mr. Armitage. The curtain has fallen." As they led him away into the foggy night, I felt a shiver of awe at the strange vanity that had driven him, and at the colder, surer genius of my friend who had read it as one reads print upon a page. But I knew from the faint tightening of Holmes's jaw that his mind was already turning to the final knot, the precise demonstration of every link that bound the hand upon the ceiling to the hand that struck the fatal blow. The grim procession of Lestrade and his men faded into the fog, leaving Holmes and me in the ransacked chamber with its hanging cords and smudged ceiling. The air reeked of soot and camphor, as though the very walls had absorbed Armitage's feverish rehearsals. Holmes moved among the scattered objects with measured calm, his fingers brushing over coils of rope, half-burnt tapers, and scraps of legal parchment covered in furious scrawl. He picked up one of the soot-blackened gloves and held it against the ceiling, where a half-formed handprint marked the plaster. "You see, Watson," he murmured, "he was perfecting his illusion. The first attempt in Brook Street was bold but crude. Too much soot, too neat a scar, too easily unmasked. Here he meant to refine it, to create a mark so strange, so inexplicable, that even the most stubborn inspector must doubt his own reason." He let the glove fall back to the table. "Vanity is a cruel master. It goads a man to extravagance even while the gallows waits, sir." I gazed about the chamber with unease. "But why the hand, Holmes? Why that singular device?" "Because it is the most personal of signatures," Holmes replied. "A hand is both anonymous and intimate. It could be any man's, and yet once marked with a scar, it points accusingly at one alone. Armitage intended it to be both mystery and proof, to mislead the eye and bind suspicion where he wished. It is the lawyer's trick, Watson, to dazzle the jury with spectacle while concealing the weakness of the case beneath." He moved to the table and opened a leather folio, where neat bundles of correspondence lay. "Ah, here we have his papers. Letters from creditors, memoranda of debts, and, yes, an agreement drawn between himself and Sir Geoffrey Burnwell. Observe the date, 3 months ago. Sir Geoffrey was to invest a considerable sum in a speculative venture. Railways in the colonies, no doubt ill-founded. Armitage counted upon it to free him from ruin. When the baronet withdrew, Armitage was undone." Holmes held up the unfinished letter we had recovered from Brook Street and compared the hand. "It is as I thought. Sir Geoffrey was rejecting the barrister's last desperate entreaty. That refusal sealed his fate. The blow that killed him was not struck in passion, but in calculation. Armitage could not risk the letter being finished, lest it serve as witness against him. He silenced the hand that wrote it, and then inscribed his own upon the ceiling. The logic of it chilled me, yet I felt still a gap in the chain. But the mechanics, Holmes, the cord, the chandelier, the wax upon the cornice. Why not kill and flee? Why waste time with this elaborate contrivance?" Holmes smiled faintly as one humours a pupil. "Because, my dear Watson, he was not content with safety. He craved admiration. To him, the crime itself was theatre. The mark upon the ceiling was his bow to the gallery, his proof of cleverness. He imagined himself master of a drama in which Scotland Yard would play the baffled chorus. But vanity blinds, and he left us the very props with which to reconstruct the play. He folded the documents and slipped them into his coat. Come, Watson, we must return to Baker Street. Lestrade will soon clamour for a full account, and I would prefer to present it on my own terms." We quitted the lodging-house and stepped once more into the wet, echoing streets. The fog wrapped around us like a curtain closing upon the scene. Holmes walked swiftly, his cane tapping in rhythm with his thoughts. I followed, my mind teeming with images of soot-black hands and lifeless eyes, of ropes swinging from chandeliers, and of a barrister whose wit had curdled into madness. At Baker Street, Holmes wasted no time. He spread the recovered letters and gloves upon the table, arranging them with the care of an actor setting his stage. "When Lestrade arrives," he said, "we shall provide him with the denouement. It will be a lesson in how vanity supplies the rope, which justice merely tightens." I could not restrain a smile at his certainty. And yet, Holmes, you speak as though the trial were already won. Holmes lit his pipe and sank into his chair, the smoke wreathing his hawk-like profile. It is. Armitage's guilt is as plain as the print upon the plaster. The law will require each link forged, motive, means, opportunity, and we possess them all. The debts that drove him, the quarrel overheard, the unfinished letter, the glove with its scar, the soot and wax, the very apparatus of his deception found in his chamber. No jury will resist such a chain. What remains, Watson, is the pleasure of laying it out with due clarity. For though justice may be content with proof, I confess I take a certain aesthetic delight in symmetry. He leaned back, eyes half closed, and for a while we sat in silence, the crackle of the fire the only sound. At length he spoke again, more softly. It is curious, is it not, how men reveal themselves? The soldier leaves footprints, the thief leaves scratches, the lawyer leaves arguments. Armitage could not resist leaving a gesture, a handprint that spoke louder than his silence. In striving to impress the world, he ensured his own exposure. As dawn began to pale the shutters, a knock announced Lestrade's return. He entered briskly, his face alight with grim satisfaction. "We have him safe, Mr. Holmes, in irons, and blustering as only a guilty man does. But I'll not deny it was your net that caught him. Now, for the love of heaven, will you tell me how all these devilish signs fit together? My men gape at that hand on the ceiling as if Beelzebub himself had pressed it there." Holmes smiled, his eyes glinting with the quiet fire of triumph. "Sit, Lestrade. You shall have the tale entire, and when you present it in court you may, if you wish, omit my name. Let it be thought Scotland Yard saw through the smoke and soot unaided. Vanity, you know, is not confined to criminals." Lestrade flushed but took the chair. I opened my notebook, ready to record the unfolding of Holmes's demonstration. For I knew that what had begun as a grotesque riddle in soot and scar was about to be resolved into one of those lucid explanations that left no corner in shadow, save, perhaps, in the hearts of men like Robert Armitage, who mistook vanity for genius and found instead the gallows rope. Holmes did not begin at once, but leaned back in his chair, his long fingers pressed together beneath his chin, while the smoke from his pipe curled lazily toward the ceiling. Lestrade shifted impatiently, his notebook already poised, while I found myself leaning forward, eager to hear the final skein drawn tight. At last Holmes spoke, his voice calm and precise, as though dictating a case history rather than unveiling the design of a man's ruin. "You will recall, Lestrade, that the door of Sir Geoffrey's study was locked from within, the key projecting from the ward. To a hasty eye, that suggested suicide or the work of some household hand. But the scene betrayed artifice. The hand upon the ceiling was no accident of soot, but a contrivance executed with cord, wax, and glove. A pulley was improvised upon the chandelier, the cord tarred and treated with camphorated oil, to run smooth and leave no fray. The glove, prepared with soot, was drawn aloft and pressed against the plaster. A flick of the wrist released the cord, which grazed the cornice in its recoil, leaving the smear we observed. Lestrade scribbled furiously, his brows drawn low. "But the door, Holmes, the locked door." "Elementary." A loop of string slipped beneath the panel, caught upon the key and turned it from the outside. A schoolboy's trick, but serviceable when the watcher is not alert. Sir Geoffrey, absorbed in his letter, was struck down with a blunt instrument. Likely that paperweight you found upon the desk's corner, though it had been carefully wiped. The rest was theatre. The handprint was meant to baffle you, to divert your suspicion toward the butler with his matching scar. But Armitage overplayed his hand, if you will pardon the phrase. His eagerness to display wit betrayed him. Lestrade looked up sharply. "And his motive? Debts alone?" "Debts sharpened by humiliation," Holmes answered. He held up the unfinished letter. "You leave me no course, but—" Those words were meant to dismiss Armitage's scheme once and for all. A proud, vain man cannot endure the contempt of a patron whose money he craves. In silencing Sir Geoffrey, he sought not only relief from ruin, but revenge for wounded vanity. Yet even that did not suffice. He must leave behind a puzzle, a signature that would confound the world and, in his twisted imagination, win him the admiration denied in life. I interjected, unable to contain my curiosity. "But why rehearse the trick again in his chambers, Holmes? Why court discovery with cords and soot scattered about?" Holmes's smile was thin. "Because men of his temperament cannot resist admiring their own reflection. He wished to perfect the performance, perhaps to stage another when suspicion pressed him too close. Such men believe in their own cleverness until the last rope is tied about their neck. Lestrade gave a grunt that might have been satisfaction or disbelief. "You've a tidy case, Mr. Holmes, and I'll not deny it was your nose that scented the trail. The gloves, the soot, the letter, aye, the very scar upon his thumb. It will satisfy a jury well enough." Holmes waved a hand as though brushing aside such concerns. "It is immaterial to me who receives the credit, Lestrade. Only that justice is done. Present it as you will. Present it as you will." For a moment the inspector hesitated, then tucked his notes into his pocket with a curt nod. "He'll hang for it, no doubt. And I'll say this, never in my years at the Yard have I seen such a performance as that hand on the ceiling. The devil himself might have envied the cunning." "On the contrary," Holmes replied quietly, "the devil would have shown more discretion. Armitage was but a poor mimic of genius." After Lestrade's departure, silence fell upon Baker Street. Holmes stretched his long limbs before the fire and closed his eyes, while I sat with pen poised, eager to record the case while its details were fresh. I had come to recognize that, for all his brilliance, Holmes often lapsed into brooding quiet after the culmination of a chase, as though the exertion of thought had drained him more thoroughly than any physical labor. At length I ventured, "You speak often of vanity as his downfall, Holmes. And yet, is it not akin to your own delight in unraveling such puzzles? The difference perhaps only in direction?" His eyes opened sharp and amused. "An apt question, Watson. But consider, I delight in unveiling truth while he delighted in concealing it. Where I seek clarity, he pursued confusion. Vanity may drive both, but in one it sharpens the intellect. In the other it corrodes judgment. Armitage sought an audience for his cleverness. I seek only the satisfaction of reason. That distinction, my friend, is the gulf between law and crime." I could not help but smile at his distinction, though I wondered how far his humility stretched. Yet before I could pursue it, the morning papers arrived, already blazoning the strange affair of the handprint on the ceiling. Though the facts were sparse, the headlines bristled with sensation. The public had their marvel. The Yard would have its conviction. But I knew that only in this quiet room had the true pattern been seen. Holmes folded the paper with disdain. "They will prattle of devils and spirits, of ghosts leaving their marks upon plaster. Let them. The world loves superstition more than science. But in the record of your pen, Watson, I trust you will grant a more rational account." "Most certainly," I assured him. "Though I fear even in truth it will sound stranger than fiction." Holmes allowed himself the faintest of smiles. "That, Watson, is the charm of fact. It requires no embroidery to outshine invention." The fire burned low, the fog outside lifting with the first pale shaft of sun. The case was closed, the culprit secured, and yet I knew that in some dim chamber of Holmes's mind the puzzle of Robert Armitage would linger, a reminder that vanity may drive men to crimes as bizarre as any phantom tale. For my own part, I closed my notebook with a sense of wonder and relief, resolved that when I set pen to paper, it should be under the title Holmes himself had spoken with such cold precision, "The Case of the Handprint Found on the Ceiling." For several days after Armitage's arrest, Baker Street settled into one of those lulls that were both a relief and a torment to Holmes. He drifted between the chemical table and his violin, often spending hours stretched upon the sofa with his eyes closed, the tips of his fingers pressed together in that attitude of brooding thought which I had come to recognize as his resting state. The case in my mind was resolved with a completeness that left little to be desired, yet I sensed in Holmes a peculiar restlessness, as though the affair still possessed some hidden facet he had not turned fully to the light. On the fourth morning, while I sat at the table reviewing my notes for the eventual chronicle, a knock sounded, brisk and insistent. Lestrade entered, his expression drawn tighter than usual. He laid a folded sheet upon the table without preamble. "This arrived at the Yard last night. Addressed to me, but it bears your friend's hand in every line." I unfolded it. The writing was sharp, slanted, vigorous, Armitage's style unmistakable. "To Inspector Lestrade, you may clap irons upon my body, but you will never chain the brilliance of my mind. I leave you this final mark, that the world may see the futility of your plodding pursuit. Look to the ceiling of the jail cell, and you will find my true defense." I stared, bewildered. and turned to Holmes. His eyes shone with that cold gleam I had seen at Brook Street, when first he looked upon the soot-black hand. He sprang up, seized his coat, and demanded Lestrade's cab without delay. At Newgate we were admitted into the governor's office, where the inspector led us down a narrow corridor to the cell in question. The door swung back, and I confess my heart jolted at the sight. Above the cot, upon the whitewashed ceiling, was the dark outline of another handprint, broader, clearer than the first, each finger distinct, pointing downward as though in mockery of the prisoner below. Lestrade muttered a curse. The devil take him, how did he manage it? We searched him top to toe, stripped him of every possession, and yet he conjures this. Holmes drew the governor aside. When was this discovered? This morning, sir. The warder swears it was not there at lights out. Armitage laughed when asked about it, said it was proof that no bars could bind his genius. Holmes mounted the cot, his gaze close upon the print. He scraped a fragment with his penknife, sniffed it, and nodded. Soot again, mixed with oil. There is a faint smear along the cornice, where a line was drawn taut. He contrived the trick within his cell exactly as before, cord over the lamp hook, glove smeared and drawn aloft. Someone has furnished him with the materials. Lestrade bristled. But who? None of my men, not your men, Lestrade. His vanity is too great to risk secrecy. He must have boasted to a sympathizer. There is always someone who admires the wrong sort of cleverness. Holmes leapt down, his face grave. You must examine every visitor, every jailer who approached him. The accomplice will not be far. Back in the governor's office, Holmes demanded the register of callers. Only one had visited Armitage since his arrest. A clerk from his chambers, admitted under proper authority to deliver documents pertaining to his case. Holmes scanned the name, his brow furrowing. Mr. Henry Felton. Does the name signify Lestrade? The inspector shook his head. A junior, no doubt. They come and go in those chambers. Holmes's eyes gleamed. Then let us go and see how far this junior is willing to go for his master. That afternoon we found ourselves once more in the Temple, climbing the narrow stair to the chambers that had served Armitage so long. The clerk received us with nervous civility. He was a slight young man, scarcely more than 25, with ink-stained fingers and a tremor in his voice. Holmes regarded him with a courtesy that was all the more unsettling for its quiet precision. You visited your employer in Newgate, Mr. Felton, Holmes began. You carried him papers. Did you also carry him cord wax and soot? Felton's face blanched. I know nothing of it, sir. Holmes's gaze sharpened. Your loyalty is commendable but misplaced. You aided him in a childish display that now imperils your own freedom. The handprint upon his cell ceiling bears the same marks as the one you helped him contrive in his chambers. Shall I summon the yard to escort you? The young man's composure broke. He collapsed into a chair, burying his face in his hands. He swore it was harmless, he cried. A trick, nothing more. He said if he could bewilder the jailers, it would prove his brilliance and the world would speak of him. He made me promise. He said I should be part of history. Holmes's voice was cold as steel. History remembers such men, but not as heroes. You smuggled him soot and cord thinking to serve genius, but you served only vanity. Consider yourself fortunate that his final act was merely paint upon plaster, not blood upon your hands. Lestrade seized the trembling clerk and led him away, muttering that the magistrates would decide his fate. When they had gone, Holmes stood at the window, his profile against the late sun, his eyes far away. You see, Watson, he said at last, Armitage could not endure obscurity even in confinement. He must leave one final flourish, one last hand raised to command attention. Such men are doomed by their own craving. They are never content to escape. They must be admired even in downfall. As we left the Temple and crossed into the Strand, I glanced back at the grey spires and narrow courts, wondering how many secrets lay hidden in their shadows. Holmes walked briskly, his stride unhurried yet full of purpose, as though the closing of one case only opened the path to the next. For my part, I felt the weight of the affair still heavy upon me, the grotesque handprints, the vanity that had driven a clever mind to ruin, and the cold certainty with which Holmes had unravelled it all. And yet, in Holmes's face as the evening fog gathered once more, I thought I glimpsed something beyond triumph, a shadow of weariness, perhaps, or the recognition that for every puzzle solved, another waited just beyond the veil of smoke and soot, the veil of smoke and soot. The following evening, Holmes was uncharacteristically subdued. The fire burned low in our sitting room, casting long shadows across the Persian rug, and though the city outside was noisy with carriages and street cries, within there was a silence broken only by the faint crackle of coal. I had hoped that the capture of Armitage and the exposure of his accomplice would bring him satisfaction. Yet he sat motionless in his chair, pipe extinguished, his gaze fixed upon some private horizon invisible to me. "You are not content, Holmes," I said at last, laying aside the newspaper, which trumpeted the case as a triumph for Scotland Yard. "Surely the affair is complete. The man is secured, his guilt demonstrated and his theatrics laid bare. What more can you require?" Holmes's eyes flickered toward me, then back to the fire. "Completion, Watson, is a word men use when they can no longer endure inquiry. The law has its prisoner, and the public its tale of marvels. But I ask myself still, what would have been the final act had we not intervened?" I frowned. "Do you mean he had some further design beyond Sir Geoffrey's murder?" Holmes rose and began to pace, his long fingers interlaced behind his back. Armitage was not content with one gesture. Vanity such as his feeds upon escalation. The handprint in Brook Street was the opening scene. The rehearsal in his chambers the second. Even the mark upon his cell ceiling was but a coda, a desperate attempt to prolong the applause. But had we not checked him, I believe he meant to leave London with some spectacle that would echo long after his flight. The props we discovered, chemicals for smoke, tapers for flame, suggest more than a mere prank upon plaster. The thought chilled me. "Then you think his crime might have multiplied?" "Assuredly. Such men do not rest with a single stroke. They seek to outdo themselves. It is the same in art as in crime. The second performance must eclipse the first." Before I could reply, the bell rang sharply. Mrs. Hudson brought up a telegram. Holmes tore it open, scanned the lines, and tossed it across to me. "Armitage attempted escape during transfer. Overpowered warders with aid of smuggled implement. Recaptured after struggle. Demands to see Holmes. Lestrade." Holmes's expression sharpened with sudden interest. "The final curtain rises sooner than I thought. He calls for me, Watson. He will not go to the gallows without an audience." Within the hour we were at Newgate once more. The governor led us down a stone passage that smelt of damp straw and iron. In a narrow chamber sat Robert Armitage, his wrists manacled, his face pale yet still animated with that restless fire which no fetters could subdue. He looked up as Holmes entered, and his lips curved into a smile that was half sneer, half triumph. "You see, Holmes," he said, his voice hoarse but steady, "bars cannot cage imagination. They drag me to trial. They speak of ropes and gallows, but my mark remains. The world will remember the hand on the ceiling long after it forgets your tedious explanations." Holmes regarded him coolly. "The world remembers the gallows more than the hand, Mr. Armitage. It is not admiration you have secured, but infamy." Armitage leaned forward, the chains clinking. "Infamy is better than silence. I tell you this, even when they hang me I shall leave behind a riddle they cannot solve." His eyes gleamed with a manic pride. "I have written it already, hidden it where they will least expect. When they find it, they will speak my name again." Holmes's gaze did not waver. "A riddle, yes, but riddles are meant to be solved. You mistake notoriety for genius, Armitage. The true test of a mind is not in bewildering the crowd, but in unveiling what is hidden." The prisoner laughed bitterly. "Say what you will. You and I are not so different. You seek your applause in triumphs of deduction, I in triumphs of deception. Two sides of the same coin, Holmes, but mine will shine longer, for men love mystery more than truth." Holmes's eyes hardened. "If there is a kinship between us, it is only that I have seen too often the ruin of men who mistook vanity for brilliance. You are not a rival, Armitage. You are a caution." For a moment silence fell, broken only by the drip of water in some unseen drain. Then Armitage's shoulders slumped and the fire left his eyes. He turned away, muttering words I could not catch. The governor signalled, and we were led back through the iron doors into the chill night air. As we walked toward our cab, I glanced at Holmes. His expression was unreadable, but I thought I detected in his eyes a flicker of something like weariness. "Do you believe him?" I asked. "That he has left behind some hidden message?" Holmes drew his coat tighter. "Perhaps. But if so, it will be no more profound than the others. Soot and shadows, tricks for the gullible. His mind is clever but not deep. What endures, Watson, is not the riddle but the resolution." The cab bore us back to Baker Street. Holmes sat in silence, the fog blurring the lamps into halos, his profile cut against the window. At last, as we turned into our familiar street, he spoke softly, almost to himself. "There is always another hand, Watson. Reaching upward, reaching outward, seeking to be seen. The task is to discern whether it grasps truth or only its own shadow." That night, long after Holmes had retired, I remained awake with pen in hand, striving to capture the essence of the case. The headlines would fade, and the public would soon tire of the tale, but I wished to preserve it as I had seen it, the grotesque vanity of a barrister who painted his pride in soot upon plaster, and the colder genius of my friend, who pierced the illusion with a glance. As the dawn crept pale through the curtains, I closed my notebook with a sense of finality. The case of the handprint on the ceiling was ended, though in my mind its dark image lingered still, an emblem of how far a man may fall when he mistakes spectacle for greatness, and how surely Holmes would ever stand ready to expose the difference. The trial of Robert Armitage drew considerable attention, not merely for the crime itself, but for the grotesque peculiarity of its trappings. The prosecution laid before the jury every link of the chain Holmes had uncovered, the debts that pressed upon the barrister, the overheard quarrel with Sir Geoffrey, the unfinished letter that cut short his refusal, the soot-smeared glove, the pulley contrivance with cord and wax, and the rehearsal discovered in his chambers. Even the accomplice clerk testified under pressure, confirming his role in smuggling the props for the prison ceiling's mark. Holmes sat beside me in the crowded gallery, detached yet intent, as the case unfolded exactly as he had predicted. Armitage defended himself with brilliant rhetoric, turning each point into a flourish, his voice rising and falling with theatrical cadence. He spoke of persecution, of artistry misunderstood, of a world too dull to admire ingenuity. For a moment, I thought he swayed even the jury with his eloquence, but when Holmes was called and, with calm precision, laid bare the mechanics of the crime, the string on the key, the soot upon the glove, the scar at the thumb, the vanity woven through each contrivance, the barrister's words withered in the face of undeniable logic. The verdict was inevitable: guilty, sentenced to death. Armitage heard it with a strange serenity, a faint smile upon his lips, as though even in defeat he savoured the thought that men would still speak of his curious hand upon the ceiling. When we emerged into the chill London air, Lestrade clapped Holmes upon the shoulder with uncharacteristic warmth. "Well, Mr. Holmes, I'll grant you this. You've a way of stripping the devil's paint from a wall. Scotland Yard will take the credit, as you prefer, but we both know whose mind untangled this knot." Holmes inclined his head, but his eyes were distant. "It was no knot, Lestrade, merely a ribbon tied by vanity. Once one pulls at the end, it unravels of itself. That evening in Baker Street, as we sat once more by the fire, I ventured a final question. Do you feel it, Holmes? Satisfaction? Or only that peculiar restlessness that comes when the game is ended?" He smiled faintly, drawing upon his pipe. "Satisfaction enough, Watson. The man's downfall was written the moment he sought admiration rather than concealment. Vanity is the most transparent of veils. But restlessness? Ah, yes, that is my companion until the next telegram arrives. I leaned back, reflecting upon all we had seen. The inverted hand above the desk, the pulley and soot, the flight through fog-bound streets, the desperate boasts of a man who mistook theatrics for genius. In the end, what lingered with me was not the crime itself, but Holmes's unfailing clarity, his ability to cut through smoke and spectacle to the truth beneath. And so, when I later set down the tale for my own record, I gave it the title by which it will be remembered: The Case of the Handprint Found on the Ceiling. A case that began in grotesque mystery, proceeded through deception and vanity, and ended, as always, with the quiet brilliance of Sherlock Holmes.